Take a look at the world around you. We're told we're living through a miracle, a green revolution. Electric cars, Silicon Valley, a planet on the brink. But this isn't new. In 1914, Henry Ford and Thomas Edison tried to give us the electric car. It could have changed everything. Instead, it vanished. Was it failure or sabotage? But history has a way of hiding its own miracles. More than a century ago, before Silicon Valley, before climate summits, two men, Henry Ford and Thomas Edison, imagined an electric car for the masses. It wasn't a fantasy. It was a plan. A plan that could have broken our dependence on oil before it even began. Yet that future was stolen. The question is, by whom and why? 1914, Henry Ford was the most successful man on the planet. He had perfected the assembly line. He had conquered the road. But Henry had a problem. His Model T was loud, it was vibrating, and it was hard to start. He knew that to truly win, he needed the one thing his internal combustion engine couldn't provide: silence. In the winter of 1913, the world saw Henry Ford as a man who had already won. He had just launched the moving assembly line. He was the king of the industrial age. But every king has a mentor. And for Henry, that was Thomas Edison. Edison had given Ford his first big break as an engineer years earlier. Now, Ford wanted to return the favor. He didn't just want Edison's friendship, he wanted his brain. In early 1914, Ford confirmed to the New York Times what many thought was a wild rumor: Mr. Edison and I are working on an electric automobile which will be cheap and practicable. Ford didn't just talk. He acted. He funneled $1.5 million, that's roughly $45 million today, into a top-secret facility in Dearborn. He even bought a power plant in Niagara Falls specifically to charge these future cars. He wasn't building a toy. He was building the Ford of the future. But the first prototypes were strange. This wasn't a Model T. It was a rolling science experiment. It had no steering wheel. It used a tiller, a long handle like a boat's rudder. The frame was swoopy and light. But under the seat lay the secret weapon, Edison's nickel-iron batteries. Edison called it his miracle battery. Unlike the heavy lead-acid batteries of the time, these were built like tanks. You could overcharge them, freeze them, or leave them for years, and they would still work. In fact, some of Edison's original batteries from 1914 are still functional in museums today. On paper, it was the perfect energy source. But there was a catch. A fatal one. While they were durable, they were lazy. They couldn't release energy fast enough to give a car the kick it needed to climb a hill or accelerate onto a busy street. They were also prone to leaking hydrogen gas, meaning if you charged them in a closed garage, the whole place became a bomb. Ford's engineers, led by Fred Allison, were terrified. They were watching the Model T make millions, and they saw this electric project as a distraction, a threat. They called it the Wizard's Folly. But they couldn't tell Henry that. He worshipped Edison. Henry Ford had a singular vision for America. He wanted a world that was loud, fast, and fueled by the black gold bubbling out of the Pennsylvania soil. He was the prophet of the internal combustion engine. But every evening, when the prophet of gas returned to his grand estate, he was met with a silent, humiliating truth parked right in his own driveway. This was Clara Bryant Ford, the woman Henry called the Believer. She had been with him since he was a penniless tinkerer. She was his moral compass. And Clara Ford flatly refused to drive a Ford. To understand why, you have to understand the Model T experience in 1914. It wasn't just a car, it was a workout. To start it, you had to stand in the mud and heave a heavy iron crank. If the engine kicked back, it could shatter your wrist in a heartbeat. It vibrated, it smoked, it leaked oil on your Sunday best. To Clara, the Model T wasn't progress, it was a nuisance. Clara's choice was the Detroit Electric. It was the Tesla of its day, but with more mahogany. There was no crank. You sat down, pushed a button, and the car glided away in near total silence. It had a range of 80 miles, plenty for a day of social calls or shopping in downtown Detroit. For Clara, this wasn't just a mode of transport, it was a statement of dignity. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The man who was currently becoming the richest person in history by selling gasoline was paying for his wife's electric charging bill. But the audit reveals something even deeper. Henry didn't just allow Clara to drive the competition, he studied her. He watched how she used the car. He saw that the market for a clean, silent vehicle wasn't just a niche, it was the future his own wife demanded. At this moment in 1914, the choice was still open. The world hadn't decided yet. Women, doctors, and city dwellers were all leaning toward the battery. The electric car wasn't a failure, it was the premium standard. And Henry Ford knew that if he could combine Clara's electric comfort with his assembly line prices, the oil industry would be dead before it even started. But while Clara was enjoying the silence of her Detroit Electric, a storm was brewing at the Ford Motor Company. Henry's lieutenants, men like James Couzens and the Dodge brothers, were watching the Edison-Ford project with growing hostility. They saw the millions being wasted on batteries as a threat to their dividends. They saw Clara's car not as a prototype, but as a betrayal of the Ford brand. They knew that if Henry succeeded, the entire infrastructure they were building, the refineries, the parts, the oil contracts, would be worthless. A war was being fought for the soul of the 20th century. And the battlefield wasn't a factory floor. It was Henry Ford's own dinner table. In our next chapter, the secret lab explodes, not with an invention, but with a scandal that would cost Ford $1.5 million and the world a century of clean air. By mid-1914, the $1.5 million investment was beginning to look like a $1.5 million anchor. Inside the secret Dearborn lab, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of acid and the tension of a failing dream. Henry Ford's engineers were facing a mathematical nightmare. The Model T was a masterpiece because it was light, but Edison's nickel-iron batteries were heavy. To get the range Henry demanded, they had to add so much weight that the car's legendary suspension simply collapsed. They tried to build a new, heavier frame, but that made the car slower, which required more batteries, creating a cycle of failure that no one dared explain to the boss. Then, the audit reveals a moment of genuine corporate deception. Ford's head engineer, Fred Allison, knew a public test was coming. He knew that if the Edison-Ford car failed to move, heads would roll. So, the engineers did the unthinkable. In the dead of night, they ripped out Edison's experimental cells. In their place, they stuffed the prototype with standard, heavy-duty lead-acid batteries, the very technology Edison was trying to render obsolete. It was a Lee Frankenstein fix. It made the car move, but it was a lie. They were selling Henry a future that was powered by the past. When the truth finally came out, and in a company as gossipy as Ford's, it always did, Henry didn't just fire people. He had what his assistants called a conniption. He saw the battery swap not as a technical workaround, but as a personal insult to Thomas Edison. In a fit of rage, Ford didn't just stop the funding, he ordered the prototypes destroyed. He wanted the evidence of the betrayal gone. But here is the audit's darkest question. Did the engineers sabotage the car because they had to, or because they were being paid by the oil interests to make sure it never worked? By 1915, the secret lab was empty. The lights were out. And the gasoline engine was the only survivor. While Henry Ford was chasing a dream of silent, electric harmony, a titan was watching from the shadows of 26 Broadway. John D. Rockefeller. By 1914, Standard Oil had been officially broken up by the Supreme Court, but the ghost of the monopoly was more powerful than ever. Rockefeller didn't just sell oil, he sold the infrastructure of the modern world. Every time a Model T rolled off the assembly line, it wasn't just a win for Ford. It was a guaranteed, lifelong customer for the oil industry. An electric car didn't need a refinery. It didn't need a pipeline. It only needed a plug. To the oil barons, the Ford-Edison project wasn't just a competitor. It was an existential threat to the greatest wealth-generating machine in human history. The audit reveals a calculated move. Standard Oil and its offshoots began a massive lobbying and marketing campaign to associate gasoline with freedom and the open road. They funded the first highway systems, ensuring that every mile of pavement led to a gas station, not a charging port. They branded the electric car as feminine, a car for the city, for the short trip, for the week. They positioned the gasoline engine as the manly choice for the explorer. By the time Ford's engineers were sabotaging the project from the inside, the world outside had already been paved in favor of the internal combustion engine. The trap was set before the first battery was even cast. By 1915, the secret lab in Dearborn was quiet. The $1.5 million loss was written off as an experiment. But the real cost wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the 100-year delay that followed. Ford and Edison never spoke of the mass-market electric again. They moved on to other projects, other billions. The glitch was fixed. The monopoly was secure. And for the next century, the world would breathe the fumes of a decision made by a handful of men in a smoke-filled room. But as we look at the new electric revolution of today, we have to ask, are we finally moving forward? Or are we just finally finishing a job that was supposed to be done 112 years ago? Every audit needs a ledger. And the ledger of the 100-year glitch is written in black. Since 1914, the internal combustion engine has released over 1.6 trillion tons of CO2 into our atmosphere. But that's just a number. Let's look at the alternative timeline. If the Ford Edison project had succeeded, if the cheap electric had become the standard in 1915, the climate crisis as we know it would not exist. We wouldn't be pivoting to green energy today, we would have been born into it. We traded a century of clean air for the convenience of a gas pump and the profits of a few men in Detroit and New York. But the debt isn't just environmental. It's geopolitical. Think of the wars fought over the last 100 years. The coups, the interventions, the trillions of dollars spent securing energy interests in lands thousands of miles away. How many lives were lost defending a liquid that we didn't actually need? Then there is the health audit. Respiratory disease, lead poisoning from early fuels, the sheer noise pollution of 3 generations of combustion. When Ford and Edison let that project die, they didn't just kill a car. They signed a 100-year contract that put a price tag on the very air we breathe. So, what is the final score? Was Henry Ford a villain? Was Edison a failure? The audit says no. They were geniuses who were outmaneuvered by a system they helped create. They built a world of incredible mobility, but they lacked the courage to fight the monopolies that funded their expansion. Today, we aren't seeing a new invention. We are seeing a ghost return to claim its throne. The 100-year glitch is finally being patched. But as you plug in your car tonight, remember, this isn't the future. This is the version of the past that was stolen from us. But the Ford-Edison glitch wasn't the only time a titan of industry pulled the strings of history from the shadows. Join us next week as we open a new file on the man who didn't just own the banks, he owned the system itself. Next time on Time Recalls, we reveal the cold, calculated power of J.P. Morgan. The audit continues then. Thanks for watching.